Getting sick nowadays is basically a minor inconvenience. You swallow a couple of pills, sip some chicken broth, binge a show you've already seen 4 times, and within a week, you're back to your regularly scheduled life. Easy. But turn the clock back a few centuries. Catching an illness wasn't just a rough weekend. It was a full-blown existential crisis with a side of absolute lunacy disguised as medical treatment. So grab your leeches and say your prayers, because we're about to walk through some of the most horrendous ways people fell ill before modern medicine finally decided to roll out of bed and do its job. Chapter 1. The Black Death. Europe's uninvited houseguest. Let's start with the reigning champion of all plagues, the Black Death. It swept into Europe around 1347 like a houseguest who kicks down your door, eats everything in your fridge, and then sets fire to your living room. This bacterial nightmare wiped out roughly a third of Europe's entire population. A third. That's not a typo. We're talking somewhere between 75 and 200 million people. Simply gone. Erased from the census as if they had never existed. The bacterium responsible was Yersinia pestis, hitching a cozy ride on fleas that lived on rats. But here's the problem. Nobody in the 14th century knew that. Not even close. The leading medical theory at the time? Bad smells. Yes, doctors genuinely believed that foul odors, or miasma, were responsible for spreading the plague. Their solution? Sniff flowers, carry little pouches of herbs, maybe light some incense and hope for the best. Truly groundbreaking stuff. The symptoms were, to put it mildly, nightmarish. It usually started with fever and chills, nothing too alarming. But then came the buboes, swollen, blackened lymph nodes the size of eggs that erupted in your armpits and groin. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering your body had decided to grow its own collection of agonizing, pus-filled ornaments. Lovely. From there, things escalated quickly. Gangrene turned fingers and toes black. Internal bleeding created dark patches across the skin, and most patients were dead within a week. Some unlucky individuals developed the pneumonic variant, which attacked the lungs and could kill you in as little as 2 days. A speed run, if you will. And the cures? Oh, you're going to love this. Some doctors recommended sitting between 2 enormous fires to sweat the disease out of the body. Others suggested drinking a delightful cocktail made from crushed emeralds. A few physicians even advised patients to inhale the fumes from a latrine, because apparently the only thing that could defeat a bad smell was an even worse one. But perhaps the most popular treatment involved lancing the buboes with a knife and draining the pus, often performed by a barber with zero medical training and hands dirtier than a pig farmer's boots. Shockingly, this did not improve survival rates. The psychological toll was just as devastating. Entire communities collapsed under the weight of paranoia and grief. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Families abandoned their own sick relatives in the street like spoiled produce. Religious flagellants wandered the countryside whipping themselves bloody, convinced that enough self-inflicted punishment might persuade God to call the whole thing off. Spoiler, it did not. The Black Death didn't just kill people. It dismantled civilizations, shattered economies, and left survivors wandering through a world that looked like the aftermath of a very poorly managed apocalypse. And the worst part? It kept coming back. For centuries. Like a sequel nobody asked for. Chapter 2. Smallpox. The gift that kept on giving. If the Black Death was a wrecking ball, smallpox was more like a slow, meticulous arsonist. The kind that burns your house down room by room while making you watch. This virus plagued humanity for thousands of years, and conservative estimates suggest it killed around 300 million people in the 20th century alone. 300 million. In the same century, we had cars and telephones. So imagine what it did before that. Smallpox usually announced itself with a high fever and body aches, which at first could be almost anything. But then the rash appeared. Small red spots that turned into raised bumps, which then filled with thick, opaque fluid, slowly covering the entire body from scalp to sole. Your face, your arms, even inside your mouth. Nowhere was safe. These pustules were packed densely together, sometimes merging until the victim's skin resembled a topographic map of pure suffering. About 30% of those infected died, usually within 2 weeks. But surviving wasn't exactly a victory lap either. The pustules left deep, permanent scars that disfigured faces beyond recognition. Blindness was a common parting gift. And if you were a child, which most victims were, congratulations! You now got to spend the rest of your life looking like you lost a fight with a cheese grater. Treatments varied by culture. And by varied, I mean they were all equally useless. In medieval Europe, the so-called red treatment was popular. The idea was to surround the patient with red objects, red blankets, red curtains, red clothing, because red was believed to draw the disease out of the body. Did it work? Absolutely not, but at least the room looked festive. In China, some practitioners developed a crude form of inoculation. They ground smallpox scabs into a fine powder, then blew it into the patient's nose through a straw and hoped for the best. Surprisingly, this method actually had some scientific merit and occasionally worked. Unfortunately, it also occasionally gave people full-blown smallpox instead. Bit of a gamble. The real breakthrough arrived in 1796. An English doctor named Edward Jenner noticed that milkmaids who had caught cowpox seemed immune to smallpox. So he did what any reasonable 18th century scientist would do. He took pus from a cowpox blister on a milkmaid's hand and injected it into an 8-year-old boy. Then, weeks later, he deliberately exposed the child to smallpox. Fortunately, the boy survived, and the vaccine worked. But let's be honest, if you tried that today, you'd be in handcuffs before you could say clinical trial. Smallpox was finally eradicated in 1980, making it the only human disease ever completely wiped out. It only took us a few thousand years. Better late than never, I suppose. Chapter 3. Syphilis, the Renaissance's romantic nightmare. Alright, let's talk about the disease nobody wanted to claim. When syphilis exploded across Europe in the late 1490s, every country blamed it on someone else. The French called it the Italian disease. The Italians called it the French disease. The Russians called it the Polish disease. The Polish called it the German disease. In other words, it was a continental blame game. With open sores. Syphilis is caused by a spiral-shaped bacterium called Treponema pallidum. It spreads primarily through sexual contact, which meant it moved through armies, port cities, and royal courts with remarkable efficiency. The first stage began with painless sores, something many people simply ignored. Classic mistake. Stage 2 brought rashes, fevers, and hair loss. Unpleasant, but survivable. But stage 3, the one that could appear years or even decades later, was where things became truly apocalyptic. Tertiary syphilis attacked the brain, the heart, the bones, and the nervous system. Victims developed gummas, large destructive lesions that could eat through skin, cartilage, and even bone. Noses collapsed inward. Palates rotted away. People quite literally began to fall apart. Like neglected architecture. Neurosyphilis caused madness, paralysis, and dementia. Some historians even believe that several famous historical figures, including certain kings and composers, may have had their minds slowly devoured by this spiraling bacterium. And the treatments? Absolutely barbaric. For centuries, the most common remedy was mercury. Patients were either slathered in mercury ointment, forced to inhale mercury vapor, or given mercury pills to swallow. A grim little saying circulated at the time: a night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury. Mercury, of course, did absolutely nothing to cure syphilis. What it did do was cause tooth loss, kidney failure, severe neurological damage, and death. So you would go in with one terrible disease and leave with two. Efficiency at its finest. Other treatments included guaiacum, a type of wood imported from the Americas and boiled into a medicinal tea. Patients were instructed to drink this tea while sitting in an unbearably hot room for weeks, sweating profusely, because apparently every pre-modern doctor agreed on one thing: if you were suffering, you probably just weren't sweating enough. Unsurprisingly, this also did nothing. Syphilis was not effectively treated until the discovery of salvarsan in 1910, and later penicillin in the 1940s. Until then, it was 4 centuries of slow, disfiguring horror, with a generous side of mercury poisoning. Good times. Chapter 4. Dysentery. Death by 1,000 bathroom trips. Now this one might sound almost quaint compared to the previous entries, but don't be fooled. Dysentery has killed more soldiers throughout history than actual combat. Let that sink in for a moment. You were more likely to die from what was coming out of you than from what was coming at you. Dysentery, in simple terms, is severe diarrhea mixed with blood and mucus. It's caused by bacterial or parasitic infections, usually transmitted through contaminated water. And in a world where sanitation often meant tossing your chamber pot out the window and hoping nobody was walking below, contaminated water was pretty much the only kind available. Military camps were perfect breeding grounds for the disease. Thousands of soldiers crammed together with no proper latrines, drinking from the same rivers they were bathing in and relieving themselves in. The result was predictable. Entire armies were weakened or wiped out before they ever reached the battlefield. During the American Civil War alone, dysentery and other intestinal diseases killed more troops than bullets and bayonets combined. Romantic, isn't it? The real killer was dehydration. With constant fluid loss, the body simply couldn't keep up. And in an era without intravenous fluids or electrolyte solutions, once the cycle started, it was incredibly difficult to stop. Physicians tried a variety of treatments. Some prescribed opium to slow the intestines. Technically that worked, but it also came with the small side effect of crippling addiction. Others recommended bloodletting, because of course they did. One of the most famous victims was King Henry V of England, the warrior king who defeated the French at the Battle of Agincourt. But despite conquering half of France, he was ultimately brought down not by a sword or a siege, but by dysentery during the Siege of Meaux in 1422. The man conquered kingdoms and was defeated by his own intestines. If that isn't a humbling reminder of human fragility, I don't know what is. Chapter 5. The cures that were worse than the disease. Let's wrap things up with a brief appreciation for the medical treatments that were, in many cases, more dangerous than the illnesses they were meant to cure. Bloodletting was the Swiss Army knife of medieval medicine. Headache? Drain some blood. Fever? Drain more blood. Feeling perfectly fine? Better drain some blood, just to be safe. The logic came from the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to this idea, illness was caused by an imbalance among these bodily fluids. So barbers, yes, barbers, would slice open a vein and let the blood flow into a bowl until the patient felt better, or more commonly, until they passed out. Even George Washington fell victim to this practice. During his final hours, doctors drained nearly 5 pints of blood from his body, a treatment that almost certainly accelerated his death. Thanks, doctors. Then there was trepanning, the delightful practice of drilling a hole in someone's skull to release evil spirits or relieve pressure in the brain. This procedure dates back thousands of years, and remarkably, archaeological evidence shows that some patients actually survived it, which is honestly more surprising than almost anything else in this entire story. Mercury makes another appearance here as a kind of universal cure-all. Stomachache? Mercury. Skin rash? Mercury. Existential dread? Believe it or not, also mercury. The element was considered almost magical in its versatility, which is ironic considering it's literally poison. And finally, we have the ever-popular practice of cauterizing wounds with hot iron. No anesthesia, no antiseptic, just a piece of red-hot metal pressed directly against your flesh while someone held you down. If the original injury didn't kill you, the shock or the infection that followed probably would. So the next time you're lying in bed with a minor cold, sipping your tea, taking an ibuprofen, and binge-watching something on your phone, take a moment to appreciate that you weren't born 500 years ago. Because if you had been, that little sniffle might have been treated with a bucket of leeches, a faceful of mercury vapor, and a one-way ticket to the afterlife. Modern medicine isn't perfect, but compared to what came before, it might as well be sorcery. The good kind, not the kind that gets you burned at the stake. And if you enjoyed this video, go ahead and hit the subscribe button before some 14th century barber decides to slap a leech on your forehead. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.